tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and we're talking about Lenny and Squiggy. Yeah! Okay. Alright, so before we begin, I just want to take a moment to mourn the passing of David Landers here, who played Squiggy. He died over the weekend. I don't know how old he was, but it makes me a little sad, because I've been planning this one for a while now, as long as I've known about Dr. Leonard Poe, and Laverne and Shirley was one of my favorite shows as a kid, 7, 8, 9 years old. I loved Lenny and Squiggy, and so I was sad to hear about his passing. But one of the amazing things about Laverne and Shirley that I learned, or perhaps even remembered, because once I, for research purposes, started watching some old episodes of Laverne and Shirley, it became clear that Laverne and Shirley lived in a mud flood building. And though while this is a soundstage here, this was an establishing shot anytime they cut to Laverne and Shirley's apartment. And it was a basement apartment. Lenny and Squiggy are always busting in, coming down from steps, But, here you have it. Inserting mud flood apartment living, into the American subconscious through Laverne and Shirley, which at one time I think was the #1 show on television. Right? That's really unbelievable. All right, but now it's time to move on to the story of Lenny and Squiggy. And there they are. All right, so we have Lenny here, Dr. Leonard Poe, and his benefactor, Robert Devereux. All right, here we go. There he is. Physician to the monarchs, Dr. Leonard Poe. By the late Elizabethan and right into King James, he is a physician in the court. Whether he is Queen Elizabeth's physician is not known, but he was definitely physician to King James I and to Charles I, right? And his buddy Squiggy here, who is Robert Devereux. But you can't have a Squiggy without a Lenny, right? So here we go with the story of Dr. Leonard Poe, physician to the monarchs. Okay, and so now the eminent physician, Leonard Poe, was a kinsman, probably a nephew of Anthony Poe of Papawick, who was one of Lord Byron's major tenants. All right, the son of James Poe, who was the son of Richard Poe, who more than likely was the undertaker of Sherwood Forest in 1492 or whatever that listing was. But it says nothing definite is known as to his early life. It says he acquired great skill as a physician without having had any orthodox medical education. And in 1590, he was one of the physicians of the celebrated and ill-fated Robert, Earl of Essex. And that's Squiggy, right? Right? The Earl being anxious to legalize the position of his protege as a practitioner, applied to the College of Physicians in May 1590 to admit him as a member. But the college refused to do so. Right? However, an order was made by the Privy Council, no doubt by the influence of Essex, granting Leonard Poe permission to practice. And ultimately, he receives the license of the college at the insistence of Essex. Essex essentially storms in there and says, "This is my guy. He's my doctor." Right? Gooses him right through the edge. He doesn't have any training as a physician. What is it that Leonard Poe knows? How is he so skillful a physician? What is it about him, and where did he learn it? He clearly comes from Nottingham or that area, and I would really, really, really like to know how Leonard Poe and Robert Devereux meet, right? Because, Robert Devereux is a really sort of celebrated figure in the Elizabethan court. Derby or Lincolnshire, Papawick. So let's take a look at Squiggy real quick, right? Robert Devereux. All right, so Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex here, he was a young man in Queen Elizabeth's golden years, right? And so he was quite the favorite of Queen Elizabeth. Right, here she is. and so this is the Damley portrait. She doesn't come off as the most attractive woman in the world. But one thing I notice about these portraits, and others notice as well, is how disproportionate they are, really. Look how low their shoulders are, how long her neck must have been, to wear this dress. Kind of disproportionate and not attractive people. And, all the powdered makeup that they wore, just to cover blemishes, or was their skin really sensitive to ultraviolet light? Something very strange going on, and how they present these historical figures to us. No doubt about it. So Devereux here, He was actually the first cousin twice removed of Queen Elizabeth. His grandmother was Anne Boleyn's sister. He comes from a military family. He's the second Earl of Essex. His father was Walter Devereux, who served with distinction for Elizabeth and had a lot of victories for her, especially in Ireland. And, he was a favorite of the court, and so was his son. He was a handsome young man. I believe the term they used for him was courtesan. I may get that wrong, but Elizabeth definitely fancied him. So we're talking late 1580s-ish here, Now he's awarded this sweet wine monopoly after it belonged to his father-in-law, but the Queen favored him so much that she gave him this sweet wine monopoly, which was a real sweet gig. I mean, it was big money gig, right? And and the wine would have been important with the religious ceremonies, not only the above-the-board ones of Catholicism, and I don't know what the Protestants may use it for, but, those secret underground ones, the ones for Dionysus and the elder gods, Right? The sweet wine would be very important, especially, Essex was at one time in its entirety a royal forest. And it's interesting that the Devereux actually come from Wales. I think it's, I'm curious as to how these things are assigned. He's the Earl of Essex, yet he really has no ties to that area. And that seems kind of common, actually. These guys get awarded these earldoms, for service. Who knows? Maybe the last earl died or, fell out of favor in some way. But he ends up butting heads with Elizabeth's main counsel, Robert Cecil, right, and also Sir Walter Raleigh. All right, there's no love lost between these gentlemen, as their relationships build within Queen Elizabeth's court, and his father was a military guy with successes over in Ireland, and so he wants to go, and so he says, Queen, give me a big army. I'm gonna go over to Ulster. Send me over to Ulster. I'll take care of that O'Neill guy. Right? It would be a really big feather in Robert Devereux's hat if he could go in and, conquer the O'Neills with a large force, right? And so what happens is Elizabeth gives him a really big army. And when he goes over to Ireland, he kind of chickens out. He doesn't go face O'Neill at all. Right? And he fights a lot of lesser battles in southern Ireland and suffers major casualties. Right? And ends up, by the time he does get to Ulster, he signs a peace treaty with the O'Neill clan. And this is looked at as a huge embarrassment to Queen Elizabeth, who had expected Robert Devereux, the son of the mighty Walter Devereux, to go in there and take care of business. And he really didn't do that. All right, so that caused a lot of stress back in the court. Things get really ugly, and he kind of, without getting into detail, he kind of stages a small kind of coup. He gets a small military band together to march upon the palace or whatever, and it's quickly corralled, and he's, executed. He's the last man beheaded at the Tower of London, which is, quite the distinction, right? And it's said that Sir Walter Raleigh watched the execution and puffed tobacco smoke from a high window, watching his nemesis get beheaded. And it took 3 strokes. It was an ugly beheading. Because Raleigh actually comments when he's beheaded himself, just not at the Tower of London, that please be more sure than the executioner for Devereux. But Robert Devereux was a major player in the Elizabethan court. Major player up until his disaster in Ireland, right? Lots of influence, and, it's him that gooses Dr. Leonard Poe along. All right, so now that we know who Squiggy is here, right, and how he gooses Lenny into the court, and Lenny is this really unknown quantity, right? I mean, there's nothing known about his history who knows what's known about him then, but now we don't know anything about him, but yet here he is in the court, hiding in the shadows at one of the most crucial times in our history as they present it to us, right? We have this transfer of power about to happen from the Tudors to the Stuarts when Elizabeth dies and James of Scotland takes over, unifying the crowns, right? But what else is going on at this time? The English Reformation is going on at this time, right? There's a massive divide between the Catholics and the Protestants. There are bloody wars being fought over this because, King Henry VIII wanted a divorce, That's the way they sell it to us, right? And it's also at this time that the English crown is really beginning to assert its empirical tendencies, right? It's creating its empire by creating these trade companies and going in there, like the East India Company just goes over there and takes over India, right? And it creates the Virginia Company with Sir Walter Raleigh. And so all of this is happening in and around the court. It's all information Dr. Leonard Poe would have been privy to, right? Because his good buddy Squiggy is on the Privy Council. So he's getting all the dirt, whether he's physician to Queen Elizabeth or not, but he's definitely getting the dirt once he's King James' physician, because he definitely serves as King James' physician. All right, so it's important to look at who these other players were in the Elizabethan court and those that transfer over to the Stuart. All right, and we have Robert Cecil. So Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. Not only is that interesting because of, tying that in today, Salisbury is where David Terrell, named coronavirus. So, depending on how far back you wanted to stretch your apophenia, there's connections to be made all the way back to the Elizabethan court here, to what's going on today. Right? But he was a hunchback. He stood at 5'4". He had sclerosis. Right? And there he is. Right? But he was a Knight of the Garter, which is usually reserved, I believe, for men who serve with distinction, like in a military capacity, who actually go out and fight. So that's really interesting. And he does, as I said, serve on the Privy Council. And he's first cousin to Francis Bacon. That's right, this Francis Bacon with the top hat. Right? Who also serves on the Privy Council, right? All right, so I can't get into Francis Bacon. There's a lot of videos out there, but, you don't really hear all that much about Robert Cecil, do you? And, Robert Cecil's protege, his lapdog, was none other than Georgie Boy. George Calvert, who was in the court at this time and who would have known Leonard Poe. No doubt about it. Right? John Dee. John Dee is in the court. And one of the things that's really amazing about the story coming out of Baltimore is how, like, a major figure like John Dee and a major figure like Francis Bacon and the people that I've been looking at for a while now, bringing it back, they aren't a part of this story in any sort of conventional way, and it's really fascinating to me how, even through this, I'm not going to talk about them here because they would actually be more part of the Baltimore narrative when I get there. But just again, establishing the strangeness of what's going on in Elizabeth's court, and what Leonard Poe would have been exposed to, and that he could have been bringing that information back to Nottingham and to Disney and to Byron and his other Poe writer friends. All right, and so Sir Francis Drake was there, right? He was essentially a state-sponsored pirate. He literally had the okay to go out and raid Spanish settlements in South and North America. But his name, of course, means the French dragon or the French worm or even the French duck, as I found out all these different meanings for Drake. I like worm best. Why didn't I put the French worm in there for my worm nights? And so Francis, he plays a big part in this modern historical mythology that they've created of the settling of the New World. Right? But it's really interesting because where is he from? He's from Devon, which is where the Poes are originally from. But not only that, the little township in Devon where Francis Drake is from is called Tavistock. So now, I don't know if you are familiar with what Tavistock is, or the Tavistock Institute, but that's one of the psychological warfare arms of the British government, right? And they're the ones who pumped out the Beatles and a lot of, other music, maybe perhaps every great musical artist to come out of England in the 60s. Someday I'll get to an episode about the Tavistock Institute, right? But it's just amazing that Sir Francis Drake is there because, again, it's about creating a mythology. That's what our history is. It's a mythology. It's not history. Sir Walter Raleigh's in the court, and he's also from Devon. So now the Poes are from Devon, and Sir Francis Drake is from Devon. Now Sir Walter Raleigh is from Devon. That's unbelievable. Especially the part, again, that he plays in our historical mythology, right? Because he goes on the quest for El Dorado, the lost city of gold, right? What a major, major mythological event that is, that's placed in our history, right? Because he doesn't ever find it, does he? And if he does, we never will know about it, right? Because all that money would have gone to its rightful owners, right? But unbelievable, the connections with Devon and Poe and Sir Francis Drake, and it's unbelievable. You know, Riley also popularizing tobacco, but again, now knowing what, you know, is coming out of Sherwood Forest with the Poes and the Byrons and the Disneys, you know, and the forging of mythology, especially one that they can just keep reinforcing through new stories and new movies. You know, they just recycle the same old stories. It's, you know, how many times has Robin Hood been made into a Hollywood movie? I mean, a dozen? I didn't look it up yet. But it's a lot, right? You know, John Smith is also around in this court. And now the amazing thing, and I've talked a little bit about John Smith in the past, you know, he does go, and he is the first to really explore this Patapsco River region, you know. But one amazing thing that I just learned about John Smith is that he comes from Lincolnshire, which is where the Disneys were from, right? Again, you know, to think about the mythology behind John Smith and Pocahontas and all of that, you know. Come on. All right, so now, you know, that's a good establishment of what was happening in this English court, the type of material that Leonard Poe would have been exposed to. So let's now take a closer look at him and his involvement in the court, all right? I love this picture of Lenny. All right, so let's go. So now it's July 1596, and Lenny is fully greased in, right? Totally greased in by Robert Devereux, right? But 2 years later, you know, and look at the sixes you can pull out of this date, right? An order was made by the college that Poe should be in presence. But it was found subsequently that he had a letter of protection from the Privy Council. Now, that's all the people we were talking about before. You know, Robert Cecil and Francis Bacon and John Dee and, you know, those people, right? They continue to grease him in past the college. I mean, past having any sort of medical experience. They continue to bring him along. All right, so he could not be imprisoned, right? And in pursuance to the arbitrator's decision, Poe acknowledged the censure. You know, he acknowledged that he did not have the education, right? But he paid his fine and was given security. Somebody put up money for him or something, right? For his good behavior, right? And he was therefore permitted to practice without molestation, right? And so again, it's never determined that he is actually one of the house physicians for Elizabeth, but he does attain that position for King James and continues it on through Charles I. I mean, he is there. You know, and as it goes on with during King James's reign, right, he still doesn't have this college certificate, I guess, right? And so in order to improve his position, his friends, these lords here, and the Lord Salisbury is that Robert Cecil, and so they apply to the College of Physicians on his behalf, right? But the college flatly declines, right? But it says, however, still more powerful influence was brought to work, and on the 9th of July, 1609, right, he was admitted as a fellow, right? So the king himself gets him in as a fellow for the College of Physicians. All right, so think about the relationship that he must have had with the King of England, you know, and what was going on in that royal court at the time and the information that he would have had. Absolutely staggering, right? That he kind of disappears in the historical narrative. And so there's really no need to go too much further with him on this. It does talk about his will, and he was a very wealthy man, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of his relatives and other relations quickly before I move on, and that is that his wife's name was Dionysia. You know, and I think this is kind of interesting because his good buddy, Squiggy, had the sweet wine monopoly, right? And sweet wine, Dionysus. Leonard Poe's wife's name is Dionysia. And so they have 3 sons and 6 daughters, and a couple of the daughters marry some interesting people. One of the daughters marries, and so his 4th daughter, Susanna, marries this Dr. John Bastwick of Essex, right, and afterwards of Colchester. And I wanted to bring this one up because Colchester is among the short list of places that they believe could have been Camelot, right? And so with the Apophenia and the Mud City Paradigm puzzle tree and its crazy branches, if you wanted to extend a branch out far enough, I can actually tie Poe now to Camelot and King Arthur, right? Through Leonard Poe's daughter's marriage. That's a tenuous one. That's quite a stretch, but it's in there. Right? All right, so now his sixth daughter, Frances, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it's his sixth daughter and that her name is Frances, right? She marries David Ramsay, who's page of the bedchamber to James and Charles as well, right? And so, again, think about the access that this one David Ramsay would have. And if you listen to the conversation I had with Tom, I spoil the only joke I actually kind of wrote about this, with maybe connecting him to Gordon Ramsay and scrubbing the King's bollocks. But, again, it's just unbelievable the connections that would have been there and that could have been tied back. So I can't believe I've done it. I've made it through to the end of the Poes in England. But before I move on, I do want to top this one off with a cherry by going over a list of some of the more notable people that have come from this Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, Sherwood Forest area. I'm really not going to hit on that many, and I'm sure, those in the UK, this list would mean a lot more to you. So you may want to check it out, and you may catch some names as I scroll past. But I think it's interesting that the military aspect of it disappears for almost 500 years. Right? That there's no real notable military people, yet the Disneys are from this area, and they were all military, at least at this time. There's a Churchill, and I believe this guy is a relative of Winston. And so it's here with the arts that it gets really interesting, especially the way the whole story has been building out of there, right? I mean, it's been a place of the arts and using the arts to manipulate the masses. We have architects, we've got illustrator of children's books, painters and photographers. We got a Quaker businessman here. The business names don't mean that much to me. Unfortunately, they're not jumping out. But all right, and it should be no surprise, of course, that the literature section is going to be very, very interesting. Right? Of course, we have Lord Byron here, but there's a lot of notable writers and poets. And we got a Quaker poet here. But unbelievably, I just can't believe this. Because it's a guy that just hasn't reared his head yet, and that's Peter Pan, right? J.M. Barrie is from Nottingham, or he lived in Nottingham anyway. That is unbelievable. And here all this time I thought I was going to be Peter Pan. Right? It just not happening, I guess. But that is really incredible. Peter Pan, with your PP. And we got Robin Hood and the Poes and the Disneys, right? Pocahontas and El Dorado. Hey, Francis Drake. Hey, all this historical mythology coming right out of this region, right? Really unbelievable. A couple interesting musicians come out of there. Alvin Lee from 10 Years After. I love 10 Years After. Right? Ian Pace, drummer for Deep Purple. Deep Purple, one of my absolute favorite bands. Ian Pace, an amazing drummer. And Bruce Dickinson, the lead singer from Iron Maiden. Again, I cannot tell you the stories of my love for Iron Maiden as a teenager. I was definitely a metalhead in the early mid-'80s. No doubt about it. But most unbelievable of all are the politicians. We have all these Pierrepont. We have Sir Henri Pierrepont. We have Robert Pierrepont. We have Henri Pierrepont. William Pierrepont. All these Pierreponts. And now the thing about the name Pierrepont, and I'm sure, hopefully it's ringing some bells for you guys already, but I saw the name Pierrepont when I was looking at Yale. As I mentioned in the conversation with Tom, I did go back to my hometown of New Haven over the summer, and I did take a lot of pictures around Yale, and I have one. Where is it? All right, here I am, right, in my Orioles cap, standing in front of the Skull and Bones tomb, right, the vault. Right here, and the best part about this is that they were doing construction on this building over here. And so when I was doing my creeping around and taking pictures, I walked back through the alley here to behind the vault. And it was just a big old trash heap. And the irony of that just really tickled me when I was bouncing around New Haven that day. I was really happy with myself that day. I was climbing all over Yale and hanging my stick down in grates and things like that. It was a fun day, waving at the cameras and stuff. But when I was doing my research and realizing that it was going to be a much bigger project than I had originally anticipated, and that it wasn't going to be one I would be getting to anytime soon, the name Pierrepont is really big in New Haven. But not only that, right, it's big, right, because that's J.P. Morgan's mother's maiden name. And so, I don't need to tell anyone the significance of J.P. Morgan and the role that he plays, right? But no one really, I don't think, discusses his mother so much. But he was so fond of his middle name, Pierpont, right, that he actually preferred to be known as Pierpont. That's what he wanted to be called. All right, and so when I saw that name in Nottingham, I said, well, and I knew about its connection to New Haven and to J.P. Morgan. I had to do the trace back, right, and I had to do it from his mother. All right, and sure enough, you know, you bring it back. All right, there she is, Juliet. All right, she's born in Hartford. But the further back we go, it becomes New Haven. All right, and this is an important time in New Haven. In New Haven, I'll just put it in here, is the first city that had a city plan, all right, that they mapped out a grid and built new streets, or so they say. And that's right where Yale is, and that was going to be a focus of the video. Someday I'll do it. Yeah, I hope. But you have to click back a bunch. I don't know how many times, but here we go. You know, Nottingham. Right, and here we go, right at that same time that the Poes and the Disneys and the Byrons and all those other people are there, so is Pierpont. Pierpont being the maternal side of J.P. Morgan. That is just unbelievable. And so, all right, so I'm going to close this one out here. I hope you guys had fun with this one. I certainly had a blast bringing it to you. All right, and so when we continue on, we'll be bringing this thing to America and moving it forward. All right, so remember, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies. All right, until the next one. Cheers, guys.